All right, let's get started then. So good morning to everybody, or good afternoon for those of us that might be joining from Europe or elsewhere. So my name is Raja Krishnan. I'm a commercialization manager at the University of Kentucky Office of Technology Commercialization, and I manage a portfolio of technologies that are focused in the life sciences. So welcome today to, this is the fourth webinar that we're doing in this 5-part short course on drug repurposing. The first webinar was on the intellectual property aspects of drug repurposing. The second one was related to building relationships between academia and industry. Third one was related to the regulatory aspects of drug repurposing. And here we're at our fourth one. It's been amazing so far, and we've got two great speakers today, and one from across the pond in England. So it's going to be exciting, I think, and you guys should definitely enjoy this. So let me get right to it. I don't want to spend too much time with my remarks. And let me introduce the two speakers that we have today. First speaker, Barbara Goodman. She leads Cures Within Reach and its mission of driving more treatments to more patients more quickly through medical repurposing research. She joined in 2017 as the president and CEO, and then became CEO in 2020. She has nearly 25 years of experience in healthcare, biomedical, life sciences sector. She's focused in the planning and implementation of strategic growth initiatives in both for-profit and nonprofit. She joined Cures Within Reach after leading iBio Institute Propel Center for 10 years. And she led programs there to increase the number of early stage life science startups and the success rate in Illinois for those startups. Supported iBio's international activities as well. She's previously worked in corporate strategy, business development at the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago, which is now the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. She's also worked at Cardinal Health and Chesapeake Corporation. She got an undergraduate degree in international relations from University of Minnesota and MBA from the Thunderbird School of Management. Our second speaker today is Dr. Panziarka, and he is the program director for drug repurposing at the Anti-Cancer Fund and the coordinator of the Repurposing Drugs in Oncology project. In addition to publishing papers on specific non-cancer drugs with the potential to be repurposed for oncological use, the particular project is engaged on cancer policy work related to drug licensing and similar issues. He is also on the faculty of the International School of Metronomic Chemotherapy, and some of his other research interests include a rare genetic cancer condition called Li-Fraumeni syndrome and the development of computational models of tumor growth. He is the co-founder and chairman of the George Panziarka TP53 Trust, a UK-based patient advocacy and support organization for sufferers of that syndrome. So welcome to our two great speakers today, and I'm looking forward to this. One more note, please, as we go through this, these talks, you may enter your questions in the chat box, and we could field those questions during the Q&A session that we'll have at the end. So I'm looking forward to this. I will let Barbara start.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Raja, for organizing it, and thanks to the entire University of Kentucky team for the 5-part series. I'm happy to participate and look forward to a great conversation with Pan today as well, a great not-for-profit organization that we've actually worked with. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about clinical repurposing from the not-for-profit perspective and share a little bit about how Cures Within Reach views the repurposing world and where we fit in the continuum for you today. Next slide. So just a real brief overview on Cures Within Reach. Specifically, we have been around for over 15 years, focused solely on medical repurposing for the last 12 years. All we do is repurposing. We are disease agnostic, we are geography agnostic, we're institution agnostic. We focus on finding and funding clinical research trials, proof of concept, pivotal trials, often the first in human trials, to really leverage the successes when the data is positive, catalyzing follow-on funding from other sources. So again, we do a lot of work in drugs, but we also work in devices, diagnostics, nutraceuticals, and other areas. We've done over 50 different diseases at nearly 100 projects across a lot of institutions, both in North America as well as outside of the United States, Canada, Germany, Australia, Africa, a couple other places as well. And as this slide indicates, we really do focus on catalyzing follow-on funding by the researchers that we fund. So right now, that 67 million that's listed on the slide, it's a leverage rate of nearly 10 to 1, meaning every dollar that we invest in our research that we fund has allowed our funded researchers to raise an additional $10 for every dollar that we have funded, which is really how a very clear measure of how we measure our success. Next slide, to just make sure that we're all on the same page. And again, since this is the fourth session that some of you have participated in, there is a lot of work on repositioning. And I just want to clarify how Cures Within Reach views that. We talk about repurposing when something already has regulatory approval by some agency. It could be the FDA, it could be a European agency or a Canadian FDA agency, but some regulatory body has approved the drug, the device, the diagnostic for a specific indication, and the researchers and clinicians want to test it in another indication, which is slightly different than repositioning, or often sometimes called rescue, when an industry player or someone has perhaps shelved a drug, maybe because it doesn't work, or maybe if it's just for strategic interest, they just are not moving it forward. And clinicians and researchers look to take that off the shelf. That's a great example of remdesivir for COVID is repositioning. So it was never all the way to approval, and they pulled it off the shelf and brought it to clinical trials for COVID, remdesivir. The other thing to make sure that we're all on the same page is when we talk about philanthropic value versus commercial value, when we're looking at repurposing. So as a not-for-profit, Cures Within Reach is indifferent whether it has commercial value or philanthropic value. Commercial value when any industry player can bring it all the way to regulatory approval and bring it to patients, versus philanthropic value, which could be that there is no regulatory path or no one will bring it all the way. It could be a generic, it could be a really orphan disease, a small patient population, just to lay the groundwork for us. The next slide really summarizes why repurposing is of value. I'm not going to spend any time on this since you're already at the fourth session, but it's a great space. We're really excited about this space and have been for over a decade. On the next slide, I think all of us have seen over the last 12 months the impact that repurposing has played in the therapeutic options for COVID-19. Unexpected, shining the spotlight on the work that we've been doing over a decade. There was a time in the summer and the fall that there were over 1,000 randomized controlled trials going on in countries all across the world to impact a therapeutic impact on patients with COVID-19. And they were mostly all repurposing trials. So clearly a lot going on there, and it's still going on. Even a 60-minute story just a few days ago was on repurposing fluvoxamine for COVID-19. So that certainly has been fascinating to watch over the last year. A great example of our work and our success is on the next slide. It's really a great example for what we do. And in this case, it's a philanthropic value. There's no commercial value here in this case. but it started well over a decade ago when Cures Within Reach funded the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, a researcher named Tichy, who used a drug, sirolimus, which is very well known in the repurposing world, and used it to treat a very, very rare pediatric disorder. It made a huge impact in these kids. He got follow-on funding, did a little bit more research. It showed to be effective. He then tested it in 5 other indications, and very quickly, through publications and presentations, a lot of rare disease clinicians were using this particular drug, sirolimus, off-label to change the lives of these patients. So our very small amount of funding allowed over $1 million in NIH funding for Dr. Tichy to impact this work. And in this case, it's a great example of how we measure our success, where this is seen in patients broadly across the world with these patients. I mentioned earlier on the next slide, it talks about the continuum of where Cures Within Reach funds and our indifference to commercial versus therapeutic value. Our ideal time to fund is the first in human proof of concept pivotal trial. It is what we call the comeback when. So researchers may have a conversation with the NIH, with an industry player who says, wow, that's a really interesting idea. Come back when you have the 5 patients. Come back when you know the dosing. Come back when you have just enough information where the NIH will do follow-on funding. That's our ideal time to fund, that proof of concept stage. Based on our funding partners, we will go earlier in late stage animal, and we absolutely will do follow-on funding as well based on, again, our funding partners. A couple of things to note, we are open to on-patent and off-patent drugs, devices, diagnostics. We are not focused solely on commercial value versus philanthropic. As I said, we're focused on the patient and the patient-first approach. And we also focus, as the bottom of the slide says, we really do focus on providing the seed funds needed to catalyze the follow-on funding by others in the ecosystem. The next slide talks a little bit about our process for making selection. Similar to the NIH, we have a 2-stage process. Researchers and clinicians submit proposals. These are short ideas that at a high level describe the type of repurposing work done. We have our staff, our science advisory board, and then an external volunteer grant review committee that represents clinicians, researchers, industry, and the patient voice to take a look at these. And then a smaller number will be invited to submit a full grant application, and then we'll go through that entire review process again and make the selection. So that's our standard decision-making process. But about 4 years ago, the next slide describes another way that we make the selection process, and that's through a philanthropic pitch event. So if any of you have been to a business plan competition where entrepreneurs are pitching their business plan ideas, think about that concept, but instead of entrepreneurs, have researchers pitching their clinical repurposing trial ideas. So it's a philanthropic pitch event. We have expert panelists who ask questions to clarify the clinical trial work being done. And the winner decided at the event, with the assistance of everyone in attendance, the winner gets a $50,000 research grant from Cures Within Reach to decide the project. So that's another way that we bring the work of clinical repurposing to the public and really engage not only patients and caregivers, but the philanthropic community in the decision-making process for repurposing. We've done that twice in a virtual world. In 2020, we're doing it again at a rare disease philanthropic event in June. We've done it in person, and it's a great way to engage the ecosystem across the board. So that's another fun way that we work. How we collect our ideas is described on the next slide. We use a Cure Accelerator platform. It is created by us about 6 years ago now. It's a place where researchers can submit their ideas in any disease area, whether or not we have a call for proposals or you just have an idea that you want to share in a lot of different disease areas. And it's at cureaccelerator.org if anyone's interested in it. And the next slide describes our current research portfolio. We do currently have funded 32 projects at 27 different institutions across mostly US, as well as Europe, Africa, Canada, a couple other places. It's in, as you can see on this slide, a variety of disease areas, although just under 40% are in rare diseases. We have a lot in oncology, neurology, infectious diseases is a new place. It's already for 13% of our projects, where at the start of 2020, we had none in infectious diseases. So COVID-19 certainly impacted that. We work a lot in pediatric space. Pediatric repurposing is obviously a great space there. A lot more information is on our website if you're interested in any of those projects. I do want to, on the next slide, draw all of your attention to a current open call for proposals that we have now, plus some that are coming within the next couple of months. We just closed a call for proposals for any disease area impacting veterans. That just finished a couple weeks ago, and the review process is underway. But it is not too late if any of you have clinical trial ideas to impact any pediatric rare disease. That call for proposal is open for, again, another couple weeks. And those proposals will be selected. 3 to 5 finalists will be pitching at a Cure Accelerator Live for Rare Diseases, again, focused in pediatrics event in June. So it's not too late to submit your ideas there. We do, coming soon, have a call for proposals in Meniere's disease and inner ear disorder. And then later this year, we will be launching any disease area led by minority and underserved researchers, as well as we are expecting to launch a call for proposals for any disease area, but to impact health disparities. So really interesting opportunities later this year. If you are interested in submitting your ideas, feel free to reach out to me, and I can hand you off to our scientific director, Claire Thibodeau. More information, though, is on our website for these RFPs and to get on our mailing list if any of you have specific ideas. The next slide describes how we measure our researchers that we fund and some of the success measures. And I think this is pretty similar to a lot of different not-for-profits, but this is certainly how Cures Within Reach looks at it. So in the continuum of how projects work, we do look at positive patient outcomes in the research that we are funding. We want and encourage our funded researchers to publish and present at key conferences. We measure how much follow-on funding our funded researchers get from the NIH, from industry, from foundations. We want to see our early pivotal studies, our small 5, 10, 20 patient studies lead to additional projects, follow-on clinical trials, whether it's a phase 2B, whether it's a phase 3. We want to see new hypotheses generated, and then certainly broad clinical adoption of the therapy, whether it's from off-label use or through a regulatory approval process. I do want to spend a little bit of time in this case talking about where these successes can happen and how we measure some successes, so you can really feel some tangible examples that we've seen over the last few years. The next slide has the same list of bullets with another success. In this case, it's an early success. This researcher in the middle of the picture with the big giant check at an event, Kim Nichols out of St. Jude Research, she won our Cure Accelerator Live for Rare Diseases event in June of 2019. And she won a $50,000 clinical research grant for her project in an ultra rare immune disorder called HLH that is using ruxolitinib, which is owned by Incyte. It's still on patent. And coincidentally, ruxolitinib is being tested for COVID-19. That project got funded by us. It was underway. And once we funded the trial by Cures Within Reach, Dr. Nichols and St. Jude were able to talk to a pharma partner who not only agreed to support with some drug, but also provide some funding for some follow-on and additional enrollment opportunities for that project, and expand the clinical trial. So a great example of how a little bit of money, $50,000 from us, can really truly lead to follow-on impact and opportunities for the researchers that we fund. Another example is a project that recently finished. This project finished last year on the next slide at the University of Chicago. This is repurposing 2 melanoma biologics when combined with radiation for stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer patients. This early study had such positive results that the researchers presented in 2020, both at ASCO and at ASTRO conferences. A major pharmaceutical player then worked with the University of Chicago to fully fund a much, much larger next phase trial at both University of Chicago and Northwestern University to expand enrollment opportunities. And that clinical trial planning is underway and will be launched later in the next couple of months at that. And it's another really good example of industry engagement follow-on funding. The next slide describes something that's closer to home. It has a University of Kentucky connection, actually. About 2.5 years ago, Cures Within Reach started a program called Impact Awards. It is for funding spin-outs and pre-commercialization startups, often spin-outs from universities, but these are for-profit entities that are commercializing repurposed therapies. And that's a program we started, again, about 3 years ago. 2 examples, the logos are there, Miticon Pharmaceuticals and Surat Pharmaceuticals. Miticon, we provided them $50,000 for a very specific project that they were working on. And back in 2020, I think it was July of 2020, the NIH gave them a $3.2 million NIH grant, along with CHOP and the University of Kentucky, to work on some traumatic brain injury opportunities for that drug company. Coincidentally, if you haven't heard, Miticon Pharmaceuticals just this week was listed as a 2021 leading pharmaceutical company to watch by Insights Care magazine. And I'm not sure if anyone on this webinar is participating in the University of Kentucky side of Miticon's research, but it's certainly a great example that's close to home for the University of Kentucky. The final example is a philanthropic value project that might have commercial value down the road. And it's a really great way that we have found to explain what's going on in repurposing on the veteran side and for active military. If you want to flip to the next slide, this is a project coming out of Penn State. Dr. Alfar, who's shown here, he won our Cure Accelerator Live competition in 2018, $50,000 project. And in this case, it's a great example. He had actually talked to the NIH about using a generic multiple sclerosis drug as a diagnostic for limb trauma patients to determine with clarity if their nerves have been severed or if the nerves were crushed, using this multiple sclerosis drug as a diagnostic. The NIH said, amazing idea. If you come back with the clear data of 5 to 10 patients, we can get you a larger study grant. And that's exactly what we funded. In the meantime, the DoD is clearly interested in this for active military, so much so that Walter Reed worked with Dr. Alfar and is using a very close study protocol in Walter Reed patients, and that research is being published very, very soon. So this is an example where the DoD is interested, the NIH is interested, Walter Reed got involved, has really intriguing prospects using a generic multiple sclerosis drug. We did just hear from Dr. Alfar that there is potentially some IP involved, and a spinout has recently licensed that technology. So it's another great example of using and creating value and follow-on funding by just a little bit of funding that Cures Within Reach provides to our researchers. The next slide describes some of the ways that both commercial value and philanthropic value are created. Whether it's developing new intellectual property or expansion, oftentimes it's a change of dosing, a change in formulation, or it could be a new delivery mechanism, changing it from an oral or changing it from an IV into an oral or into an aerosol or a nasal spray. We've seen some of those comes out. We've seen successes on the commercial side of drug combinations. Both Jazz Pharmaceuticals and Horizon Therapeutics have great examples of combination drugs and dosing changes that really adds value to theirs, as well as some market exclusivity opportunities that the FDA has provided. And as a not-for-profit, we are extremely supportive when there may not be any commercial value whatsoever, but a huge philanthropic value. The patients with unmet medical needs don't care whether there is a regulatory approval. They want something that works. They want something that clinicians know and trust. And that's the data that we're funding, to get that published data to allow clinicians to make their own decisions. We see this really often in rare diseases. We see this in the neglected tropical diseases with other not-for-profit partners that we've worked with as well. Finally, on the last couple of slides, in terms of what we have found from the learnings that researchers at universities like the University of Kentucky can take away. First of all, it frequently starts with an academic researcher, with a clinician that starts thinking about this, whether it's bench research in translational medicine, whether it's clinicians who are seeing real world evidence and they want to capture the data in a randomized control study. We know early funding is critical by organizations like Cures Within Reach, the Anti-Cancer Fund, and the NIH, specifically to de-risk it and move it farther along so that others can jump in and do follow-on funding. We know that there are startups that can be created that are spinning out, but oftentimes, if it is on patent still, the bigger players will certainly work with these university partners to out-license and bring it to commercial play. We know failure happens. It happens certainly in de novo research. The good thing about repurposing is it tends to happen less frequently in repurposing than de novo research. And there's certainly a win-win for everyone involved. I think having the University of Kentucky put on a 5-part series like this is really a telling example of the support from the University of Kentucky that repurposing is a valued space to look into research. There are universities who don't consider it innovative. We certainly do. And I think the University of Kentucky just putting this type of program on says a lot about the opportunity and the interest in repurposing for those of you at the University of Kentucky. My final slide really walks through some advantages and disadvantages. I don't think any of you are, there's nothing new here in terms of repurposing. We really do think it can be done not only with drugs, devices, and diagnostics, it can be done in a myriad of disease areas. We're not always concerned what the mechanism of action is, which is not always comfortable for people. But if it works, we want to better understand what the impact can be on patients and figure out the uses later. The philanthropic opportunity, what we call patient-first approach, whether there's a philanthropic value or commercial value, it's a huge advantage of repurposing. And it's really where we see, as a not-for-profit, we see our role is getting the data and funding the research for the data when there is no commercial value, but certainly patient value. Thankfully, the FDA for over 15 or 20 years has a 505(b)(2) pathway in the United States. There's other similar regulatory mechanisms in other countries as well. With that, I'm certainly open to questions after Pan does his side of the presentation, and I look forward to a conversation with you.
Thanks so much, Barbara. It's great to see those examples of how Cures Within Reach has impacted, and for each dollar that you've invested. So I think it's great for all of our researchers to know the value of that. So yeah. So now we'll transition to Pan's talk here, and again, reminder. You're welcome to put any questions in the chat box, and we will get to them during the Q&A. But now I'll hand it off to Pan.
Thank you. Thank you, Raja, for the invitation. And thank you, Barbara, for a really interesting overview of Cures Within Reach. Let me start by apologizing, because I'm sure I'm going to cover some of the same material that Barbara's just covered, and some of the same material that previous talks in this series have also covered. Next slide. So let me introduce the Anti-Cancer Fund. We are based in Europe, founded in Belgium in 2009, not-for-profit foundation like Cures Within Reach. And what we do is we support the development of new therapies with little or no commercial value. So we are targeting that gap. There are lots of really good ideas out there being developed, but if there's no commercial value, it's an old drug, or it's a drug that's still on patent, but there's no development pathway. We don't want to see those ideas languish. We want to test them, because patients deserve every chance they have of new therapies. We're also very patient-centric. We're primarily a research organization, a research foundation, but we provide science-based information direct to patients. We have a service, My Cancer Navigator, where patients can come to us directly and ask questions about their existing treatment, about new treatments that they're thinking of. Sometimes we have to do a bit of quack busting and tell them that there's some miracle cure on the internet they've seen is actually a fake. But we deal directly with patients, which I think makes us slightly different to many other not-for-profits in this space. We're a small organization. There's probably about, I think there are around 12 of us. Everybody is either a science background or a clinical background. And like Cures Within Reach, we don't have a geographic bias. We support projects all over the world. Next. So where we focus specifically, drug repurposing, obviously, but it's not the only area that we're looking at. We are supporting clinical trials. Some of them are repurposing, but some of them are not repurposing. And we really want to focus on those areas in oncology where there are high unmet needs. So there's been huge advances in lots of areas of oncology, but there's also many areas where there's been no change in the last 40 years. Pediatric oncology is way behind. Sarcomas have seen no change in treatment for decades. So that's where we want to focus on. Patient information I already mentioned. We're interested also in immunotherapy. So not just drug repurposing, but there are people working in that space who don't have a checkpoint inhibitor, who are working on cell-mediated immunity based on existing technology with no new IP to support them. There's a funding gap there again, and that's where we want to step in. And then a final area where we are active is on health research policy. And what we want to do is take these things that we're discovering in this repurposing and in these clinical trials, and we want to get them approved. And there are roadblocks in the way. So we are active in the policy space, looking at how we can change regulations to get treatments to patients. Next slide, please. So let me explain the things that drive our interest in repurposing. And the first one, obviously, is financial toxicity. Next, please. I mean, this is an area where the problems have got really bad in recent years, in that there are promising treatments in some cancers, but they are so expensive that most patients will not be able to access them, not just in places in developing countries, but even in developed countries. Some of these therapies are just never going to make it to patients. And the costs are going to go up, particularly when you think about how the incidence of cancer is increasing. Next, please. So one example of this, we can look at the cost of new drug approvals over time versus the clinical benefit. And what you can see in blue is that the prices are rising over time, but the clinical benefit very often is not rising or declining. So the value there is missing. Next, please. And then if you look in low and middle income countries, the costs are just way off the scale. People are never going to be able to afford those therapies. So for us, that's a factor to consider in the future. Next, please. Next. So for us, another issue is that, as I mentioned previously, that there are a range of cancers where there is, no progress. Osteosarcoma is a perfect example of this. Chemotherapy was developed, brought into play in the 70s, but it's stalled since then. Next. Brain tumors, glioblastoma, very, very similar story. So there are reasons for this. These are much more complex cancers to deal with, but they're also smaller patient populations. And so, we're looking for new therapies in areas where commercial development is lagging because of this. Next. There's also, based on our focus on patients, there are populations of patients in all countries who are effectively abandoned by the health system when they get to the end of standard treatment. Next. If you can just go through all of the things. So patients are put into palliative care. They're told to effectively go home, but the patient might still be fit and want to continue treatment. Sometimes they are directed to early clinical trials, and many early phase trials are not going to benefit those patients. We know that in advance. Some patients are completely lost to the health system at that point. They will see stuff on the internet, or they'll go to another country. Next. But there are also off-label options, but it's not licensed. And so we have to ask ourselves, is it ethical to take those patients and say, sorry, you're at the end of the line here. All of the licensed treatments have finished, and effectively you're finished too. And we really don't like that. We really want to change that view of things. And that's where repurposing can come in again. Next, please. So our definition is very much in line with Barbara's definition. Repurposing for us is the use of an existing licensed medication for a new medical indication. So we're not interested in shelved compounds. We're interested in drugs which are used and which we know what their common and very rare side effects, because they've been used for a long time. We understand the dosing and how these drugs travel in the body. They're widespread and available, so they can be implemented quickly, often, but not always at low cost. And we have some knowledge of the mechanisms of action. So for us, repurposing is a way to speed up that development cycle, but also in effectively a user-friendly way. It's convenient for patients. We know that it's safer. Next. So let me give an example, and this is a well-known beta blocker, propranolol, one of the first blockbuster drugs, originally developed for hypertension and angina. Now it has a huge range of licensed uses. And this for us is a drug which also has huge potential in oncology. And one of the licensed, new licensed indications is a disease called Infanta Hemangioma. Next slide, please. So let me tell you a little bit about the hemangioma story and why this is interesting to people in oncology. It's a vascular malformation in infants, and it had no good treatment. Effectively, it was a wait and see and hope that it improves. One infant was treated with propranolol, which is an adult drug, to treat a problem caused by the growth of this benign tumor. And over time, very quickly, the tumor went away. This was a surprise because that's not why they gave this child propranolol. But the doctors did more than just say, gee whiz. They treated more patients, published their cases. The results were confirmed in multiple clinical trials, and eventually the drug was reformulated to make it available for infants as a syrup. And in 2014, it was approved in the US and in Europe, and is now standard treatment for this rare disease. So that's an example where repurposing was commercially successful, but partly it was commercially successful because there was new IP. They could reformulate the drug and make it profitable. For us, the problem at the Anti-Cancer Fund that we're trying to tackle is that for many of the drugs we're looking at, there's no good argument for reformulation. If you're reformulating a drug purely for commercial reason, then for us, that's not an ethical take. If there is a good reason to reformulate a drug, and then you know that works, that's obviously the thing to do. But for us, doing it for the sake of IP is not what the Anti-Cancer Fund is interested in. Next. So let's get back to what we're doing in oncology. The Repurposing Drugs in Oncology project is about identifying repurposing candidates. And the data we get comes from case reports, as in that hemangioma story, but also old clinical trials that we reanalyze, literature mining, in silico modeling, huge number of different data sources. Next. We've developed an open access database where we list all of the drugs that we've found. And at the last update, we had 335 non-cancer drugs with evidence of anti-cancer activity. Around 70% of them had human data, 84% were off patent, 31% available on the World Health Organization essential medicines list. So these are, you know, a very large number of drugs with good levels of evidence. If we were a pharma company and had this kind of pipeline, we would have huge amounts of money in the bank, but we're not. Next, please. One of the things I also want to talk about is the difference between hard and soft repurposing. Now, for the thing that we're interested in specifically is taking drugs from outside oncology, non-cancer drugs, and using them to treat cancer. Not to treat the symptoms of cancer, but to treat cancer itself. But of course, within oncology, the standard practice is that you develop a drug for one target cancer or one target population with that cancer, and then you license that and then move on to the next cancer while it's still on license. The thing that we're doing, which we call hard repurposing, of taking drugs from outside oncology, is actually a really hard problem to solve. There are very few examples. Probably the most well-known is thalidomide, with its terrible history, but currently being used for to treat leprosy and lupus, but also now multiple myeloma. All trans-retinoic acid used for leukemia, diclofenac, NSAID used for desmoid tumors. But this is a really small number of drugs. Given that we've already found 335, to have trouble listing 5 positive examples of hard repurposing is a bit disappointing, but that's the space that we are focused in. Next, please. So why is it a hard problem to track? And actually understanding this gives you an insight into the kinds of things that we are interested at the Anti-Cancer Fund in terms of projects. The first one is funding, licensing, next, buzz, and experience. All of these together add up to making hard repurposing hard. So let me just touch on each of those in turn. Next, please. So let me start by saying, you know, what should be obvious. I've talked about how cheap some of these drugs are, how widely available they are, the safety and everything. But actually the single most important thing when you're talking about repurposing is efficacy. Cancer patients don't care if the drug is cheap. They don't care if it's a drug that's available in a supermarket. What they care about is, does this drug work? And that's what we care about too. And that's what makes this an expensive business. Clinical trials, especially pivotal clinical trials that are going to convince the oncology community that this is a treatment to take, are hard to do. They're expensive. It's often the case that running a pharma trial with a hugely expensive drug is a cheaper option than running a drug trial with a drug that costs pennies. The pharma company will pay for everything. If you have to pay for everything yourself, including having to pay for placebo drugs to be manufactured, etc., running a trial with cheap drugs can be expensive. But there's also things like competition for patients. Institutions have got to steer patients to clinical trials. A pharma trial will pay a premium for recruitment. We can't do that. Public and philanthropic funding, unfortunately, often is linked to having IP protection. It amazes me still that public money, which will benefit the health system ultimately, still wants IP rather than patient value. Makes no sense to me. And of course, in an academic-led trial with a cheap drug, you're going to have to do the stats, you're going to have to do the administration, all of the things that the pharma company will cover for you. So that's why, you know, it's one of the reasons why this is a hard problem to solve. Next, please. Licensing. Do we really need licensing? Well, actually we do. In some situations, off-label treatment is an ideal solution. If it's a drug that's been used for a condition for years and everybody uses it, then off-label is fine. But if it's an ultra-rare disease where all of the patients are treated in one or two specialist centers and all the clinicians are using the drug already, that's fine. But you know, there are downsides to off-label. Firstly, you're dependent on individual physician preference. Different physicians have different risk aversions. Some are willing to use off-label, some are not. We have no central repository to capture whether drugs being used off-label work or not. We need to know, not just do they work, but we need to know when they don't work. For physicians, there's increased legal liabilities. And one that we've also seen recently is some of the drugs that have been repurposed are old drugs. They're no longer used in their primary indication. And if they disappear from the market because new drugs have come in and are used, then you've lost a potential treatment. Whereas if the drug is on label, that's less likely to happen. Next, please. So we're interested in drug licensing, not because we are interested in having IP. We are, you know, definitely non-commercial. But a new license or an extension to an existing license triggers a whole cascade of important things. The drug will be included in national formularies. So doctors will be able to look up what the new indication is and what the dose is. Clinical guidelines are updated. Health technology assessment takes place. Drugs can be reimbursed. Physicians no longer have to worry about liability. And of course, we capture post-marketing surveillance, so we know when data is changing. So these are, you know, for us, licensing is an important thing to consider. Next slide. So for us, one of the things that we've looked at in our policy work is, can we change the licensing system? Next, please. So for us, as it stands, an existing drug can have a new indication added, but you need a manufacturer with a marketing authorization. Now, you know, we're in Europe, so it may be slightly different in the US. So if a not-for-profit like us comes up with a new indication, we are not in a position alone to be able to get that changed. And for a generic drug manufacturer who wants to apply for that new license, they risk the manufacturer across the street dropping a penny off the price and reaping any benefits. So for us, what we would like to see is a public interest label extension pathway, so that when we discover new effective treatments, we can get them licensed in as quickly as possible. Next, please. I mentioned buzz. You know, in oncology, it's driven like everything else. There's an excitement, there's some hype. And if you went to a cancer conference around 2005, there was standing room only in any talk on anti-angiogenics. 2021, no one cares about anti-angiogenics and everything is checkpoint inhibitors. You have to imagine that we can still do face-to-face conferences. I'm sure it will come back at some point. So we need clinicians then to run trials. But unless you've got a really sexy new molecule, you risk missing publication in decent journals. You miss the best slots in conference. You get the institutional approval, the excitement, and so on. So we need to ask ourselves, you know, what do we want oncology to be? Do we want it to be patient-centric or buzz-driven? You know, it's a human thing to be susceptible to hype, but really we need to do a bit more. Next slide, please. And then experience. When we look in our work, we look at the literature, and we find that there's been some great work done in the past, really good, strong clinical trials, and yet they don't go anywhere. What happens? And what we find is that often the trials are small, or the endpoint was underpowered, or it was a clinician-led trial, and they don't have a development mindset. They get to the end of the trial, the publication is the outcome that they're interested in, and there's no momentum for follow-up. And so one of the things that we consider when we're looking at projects is, you know, what's the development pathway, not in terms of IP development, but in terms of how do we follow up? What happens after this trial? We're not interested in a trial that finishes with a good publication. We want to get stuff to patients. So we want a pathway in advance to see. And we also recommend that people talk to the FDA, the EMA or MHRA in the UK, to get scientific advice, to actually talk through the evidence that you have and where you want to take this. Because, you know, pharma is very good at doing what they're doing. We need to get better at doing this stuff too. Next, please. So we know that drug repurposing is actually becoming more popular. This series at the University of Kentucky is an example, but you know, all of the big oncology meetings, the number of clinical trials, and it's on the agenda at the government level and at the regulator level, which is you know, really good compared to where drug repurposing was just 5 years ago. Next, please. We have developed a framework in consultation with policymakers, and you can see that it starts with the kind of philanthropic investment that Barbara talked about and the kind that we can supply, and within investigators with great ideas. And what we add to that is capturing real world data. We want an assessment by regulators to kind of take account of all of this, so that we can begin to take repurposing into the regulations and into the clinic. Next, please. I just briefly want to kind of touch on one other area where drug repurposing should be on the agenda, but often isn't. And I apologize for, on my screen, the fonts are all out, so let me apologize for that. Precision medicine is the idea that you target the specific molecular alterations that drive a patient's cancer. You personalize the treatment to that patient. Very often when we look at the data from those trials, you realize that what they've done is they've only looked at cancer drugs. And yet we know from our data and from other data published by, you know, reputable researchers in top universities, that there are molecular targets for all drugs, and many of the drugs that we've identified as having anti-cancer properties address oncogenic pathways. So it's important, if you're in precision medicine, to consider all drugs, because the more drugs you consider, the more targets you can hit, and the more chances you have of addressing the things that are driving a patient's cancer. Next, please. So let me start to wrap up. How do we make more progress? And these are probably quite obvious. We need better designed trials. You know, we've had the small trials, we've had the early phases that go nowhere. We need innovation in trial design as well. We need increased public and private funding for repurposing trials, independent of IP. We need to create pathways to make sure that positive results are followed up. Public interest label extension, I've mentioned. And then that final point, we need doctors and patients and everybody else, all the stakeholders, to lobby for change. There is some excellent scientific work being done in repurposing, but it's going to languish, it's going to go nowhere unless this is on the agenda for policymakers. Next, please. So let me come back then to propranolol. We saw in that Infanta Hemangioma, which was a benign tumor, that it had some effects. What happened next was that people thought, well, does it work in malignant tumors? And there was a range of work done in animal models, some individual case reports. We published a review that showed propranolol has real anti-cancer activity. This is an old drug from the 60s, very safe, used by millions. In particular, it seems to be effective in angiosarcoma, where the standard treatments are chemotherapy, and it has a response rate of around 25% to chemotherapy. That picture on the bottom left there, you can see an angiosarcoma patient with responding to propranolol. At the Anti-Cancer Fund, we went to the European Medicines Agency and gained orphan drug designation for soft tissue sarcoma for propranolol, not because we're interested in commercially developing this, but we wanted to make sure that this came to everybody's attention. And we've got a number of trials ongoing, including one funded by the Anti-Cancer Fund in angiosarcoma. Next. But the propranolol might also be useful somewhere else in oncology, and that's in oncology surgery. Now, for many cancers, surgery is the only chance of a cure. And as you can see from that table, for a large number of cancers, even with successful surgery that removes all traces of the tumor comes back, very often in a completely different place. So to give you the osteosarcoma example, nearly 50% of people treated successfully with surgery will develop tumors, mainly in the lungs, after surgery. So there are many different factors involved in why this happens, to do with inflammation, to do with the beta adrenergic pathway, which is targeted by propranolol. So we've got good mechanistic reasons for thinking that we may be intervene here. Next. Next. So we are pushing for a new thing called perioperative therapy. Unlike neoadjuvant therapy, which is the therapy people have before surgery, where the aim is to shrink the tumor so that it can be successfully removed, perioperative therapy is aiming at stopping the pathways that drive that post-surgical recurrence. So it's a very short course of treatment, only a week either side of surgery, but we think that this will actually reduce the number of patients who then go on to develop recurrence. Next. And here again, propranolol is on the agenda. You can see that there are multiple clinical trials using not just propranolol, but other drugs, all of them trying to address this same thing of improving survival by making sure that curative resection really is curative. Next, please. So, thank you. I hope I've expressed the questions which we're trying to address, and for projects that come to us, they're the kinds of things that we want to know. How do you address those questions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pan, for that presentation and perspectives on the Anti-Cancer Fund and also the case studies as well. So just a reminder to the audience, please do, place your questions in the chat box. With the time remaining that we have here, we'll go through these questions. We already have a couple in there right now, or two in there. So let me look, the speakers can see it as well. There's one question here about, well, first, it's great to have that funding for patients with unmet medical need. Question is about evaluating data. Real world data is optimal. Would you consider proof of concept funding for data coming from omics type and AI, in vitro preclinical efficacy for first in human trials? Either of you want to?
For the Anti-Cancer Fund, we're interested at the next stage. For us, the area that we're interested in is not first in human studies usually. I won't say in every case, but generally we're interested in efficacy trials.
Okay. Barbara, any thoughts?
Yeah. I think for us, we see a lot of the submissions that we get for our first in human pivotal studies using AI or using other omics studies already. We see it where because what we do is investigator initiated, either their team or their research has already narrowed down using AI or using some studies to say, okay, now that we've got this study, we want to use this drug because we've already ruled out all these others using those types of data sets. So we don't fund that very often, if ever, but we know it does. It's part of the package that we get from our submissions and our proposals that we'll review. It also can help us to strengthen one project over another if that data has already been thought of or used, to strengthen a project over other projects that may not have that data set. So we don't fund it unless a funder specifically said we want that, which that hasn't happened, but mostly we see it as strengthening projects versus other projects that may not have it.
Okay, so let's go to the next question here. So there's a question here from an attendee about whether really efficacy is the only important thing from a patient perspective. There's a lot of oncology drugs that just give a few months in PFS or survival at the cost of low quality of life. Do you see opportunity among repurposed drugs which are maybe not so effective but have better safety profile? Pan, you want to?
Yeah, sure. That's a really good point. Early in my slides, I showed a chart that showed increased costs with not great increases in efficacy. And increasingly, we see drugs being approved by the FDA based on marginal improvements in PFS and no improvements in OS very often at great toxicity. For us, a drug which is safe and less toxic is definitely one to look at. We're not saying it's the efficacy is the only measure, but it is an important measure. what we want is a balance of the two. But non-superiority trials, where you can show that a drug is nearly the same as an existing drug with less toxicity and better quality of life, is definitely something that we support. I mean, I think that's a really good move, and you know, we encourage that kind of trial.
Yep. The only thing I'll add to that is it's not just efficacy and need, but we also see a lot of projects that it's speed to impact. An example of that is actually the winner of our Cure Accelerator live event in 2020 in June. There were 5 projects. They had 2 pediatric oncology projects. So, you know, you have the kids with cancer goal, and then there was a couple other projects, but the project that won was using a nutraceutical. And in this case, it wasn't so much about efficacy and the need. In this case, it was $50,000 could get this trial far enough along where it really can be used in patients because of the robustness and the cheapness of the nutraceutical and the robustness of the trial. In this case, it was really cheap, and she won the competition because no one else is going to fund a nutraceutical that has no commercial value, that it's less about efficacy and more about, if this works, this can be used for patients extremely quickly. So we do support, and I agree with Pen completely. We hear from our patients involved in the studies that we fund, sometimes repurposing can just buy time until additional drugs can get out there, additional trials can get out there. So there's certainly efficacy is one, but that's not the only measure that we use.
Okay, so there was a clarification on the previous question from our participant. I don't know if she's on the line. Jayanthi, if you're still on the line, you want to open up your mic, you can just jump in and clarify. That might be easier.
Yeah, thank you, Rajan. Thank you to Barbara and Pan, excellent presentations and really very, very useful information regarding funding for repurposed drugs. So my question was, I didn't mean first in human as, you know, like in the true sense, but the drug has already been proven safe in prior use, or it has been taken off the shelf for lack of efficacy. But through omics and AI, if the drugs have been found to be good for some rare oncology or other neurodegenerative disease, would you be funding based on that data, which is omics, AI, which comes from, again, anecdotal historical data, both clinical and preclinical, and then they add some in vitro data to that, maybe some preclinical in vivo efficacy, but going into humans for that particular new indication first time? Do you fund those projects?
That would certainly be eligible for us. It depends on the project, but in this case, we have an open call for rare pediatrics. So everything you just described, if it fits our call for proposals, it would certainly be eligible to apply. Would it rise to the top? That's a different question if it's going to get selected, but it would certainly could be eligible for us.
So the point is that, that the target has been identified through omics and AI. It's not through the traditional route. Right. That's the difference. Okay, thank you.
Pan, do you have any thoughts on that clarification?
Yeah, obviously it's we're interested in that kind of data, but again, normally we would want to have some evidence that it's actually effective in humans. So, for example, if your AI or your algorithms had identified a particular target that said it would be useful in a given cancer, we would want to know, is there any registry data somewhere that can be used to support that argument? I mean, for us, it's important to have, additional validation, and that validation generally comes from either case reports or previous trials where you're able to identify which patients had the subset of the marker that you're interested in.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Okay, thanks for that question. So we'll go to the next one. This one is, looks like for Pan, directed at, this participant wants, I guess, more information, maybe even at another meeting, but looking for, I guess, drug repurposing in current trials that the fund has taken a role in, and if there's any promising data to be mentioned. I mean, they're talking about here about a next event, but is there anything you want to share on that right now?
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage people to go on our website where we list the projects that we're working on. Our 2020 impact report has just been published, and it lists a number of clinical trials that we've supported. I mean, aside from funding clinical trials, we're also involved in developing clinical trials. So not everything that we do is about supplying money. Sometimes it's supplying ideas, support, knowledge brokering, and bringing different parties together to make something happen. So our activities are not just based on funding of clinical trials. We're involved in the background with lots of different projects that maybe don't get the airtime that they should.
Okay, thank you. So another question, see here, what would be the approach to increase the attention from big pharma and increase the impact in general once you have a small trial with a repurposed drug that has promising results? And then presuming drug combinations might be the way to go. Thoughts on that? Barbara first, I guess.
Yes, sure. So I do think pharma is extremely aware of repurposing. I will say we don't use the phrase repurposing in conversation with pharma. We talk about testing already approved therapies for new indications in randomized controlled trials, which is repurposing. But industry generally and investors and Wall Street, the word repurposing doesn't always come across with a positive investment view. And so we just don't use repurposing when we're having those conversations. We talk about using already approved therapies. In addition, industry has to stay far, far away from any conversation about off-label use that they're promoting for very, very clear compliance reasons. All of that being said, we see pharma actively engaged in repurposing on their own. They're also very engaged, we have seen at least, when a researcher, a clinician is using an on-patent drug or an off-patent drug of a particular pharma companies that is making an impact. And I really think, the last 12 months with COVID-19, there are many, many examples where pharma has stepped up and provided study drug and provided drugs constantly. But even before COVID, the examples I gave, and I have a handful of others where we know industry is in conversation with these researchers, with the investigators throughout, and watching them very carefully whether or not there's IP, because often IP can be dosing or even market exclusivity where there's no IP, but there's a path, an orphan designation, or a market exclusivity path. So I do think pharma is involved. They're just involved where and when they can, based on their own shareholder requirements as well. So we see them, industry and pharma, certainly as a key stakeholder.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point there about the way you word it, right? Position it in terms of repurposing versus testing for new indications. So I think that's really good. Pan, how about your thoughts on that one?
Well, the first one is that it's unlikely that we will ever find a repurposed drug that on its own is going to make a huge difference to cancer patients. And that's just the same as commercial drug development. All cancer treatments are multi-drug treatments. So from the beginning, when we look at projects, we want to be able to slot a drug into existing standard of care. So any drug that you identify as a potential cancer therapy, we need to look at, well, these patients, they're already taking, this heavy chemotherapy. How are you going to be able to schedule this other drug into it? So that's an important point, that we should be thinking about combinations from the get-go. Secondly, for lots of companies who've got drugs, very expensive drugs often, one of the challenges that they have is they want to increase the proportion of patients that benefit for those drugs. They want to increase the proportion of benefit, and they want to increase the duration of response. So for them, it makes perfect sense if they need to add in an old drug that's going to make their new expensive drug more effective, then it becomes interesting. So it's not that the pharma companies are, all against repurposing. You've just got to pick the right combination, the right conversation to have.
Yeah, so one thing that was mentioned by this the participant here, the attendee, is, do you think, and I think a lot of academic research are looking into this, but do you think it's the drug combinations? Is that really the way to go now? Is the other part of the question?
Yeah, I think drug combinations is the way to go. Particularly when you're looking at some of the patient population with high unmet needs. They've got high unmet needs because their cancers are sort of sufficiently heterogeneous that they don't respond to the treatments that exist. So you're going to have to do something different by attacking different pathways, increasing the number of different ways you attack the tumor. I mean, for one concrete example, we had a trial in Germany in glioblastoma that included 9 repurposed drugs. So combinations is definitely something that is worth exploring, and something that we're interested in.
Okay, great. So we have a few more minutes left. Let's see. Let's go with another question here. How about collaborations, between maybe both your entities or other entities, between universities, and these different type of nonprofit funds? I mean, can you speak a little bit to that? Maybe Barbara, you could start.
Well, I think Pan just mentioned a great example. That 9 combination project was a German project that Cures Within Reach and Anti-Cancer Fund both funded. We've provided a really, really small amount of funding, but certainly led by Anti-Cancer Fund. And that's a great example where not-for-profits in the philanthropic community, every little bit counts. And so we provided a really small amount of funding, and Cures Within Reach's perspective, we're absolutely willing to, we won't do first money into a project, but we often fund, we'll increase enrollment, we'll strengthen others' funding to speed enrollment, to fund a clinical trial enrollment specialist, or to add a clinical trial site off of others' funding, and that can be across continents, certainly, and other locations as well. So I think there's a number of organizations, and even think not just organizations like Pan and mine, where we're not-for-profits in repurposing quite often, but think about it from a patient advocacy or a disease group. So Cures Within Reach has partnered with the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation on projects specific to Alzheimer's, where they have a a huge research portfolio, and where we work together is obviously on the repurposing side of the portfolio. So collaboration is very different. There's very little competition in the space that we're talking about, and I think it happens very frequently.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Maybe this one let's see, to Pan, maybe we'll do one or two more, but how about how do not-for-profits look at valuing different projects in terms of repurposing?
For us, the starting point obviously is to look at how strong the case is for that project, how big the needs are, and also the prospects going forward. So let me give a concrete example. In non-small cell lung cancer, which is historically been a very hard to treat cancer with not much happening for a long time, currently it's a really difficult space for repurposing because there is a huge amount of activity going on. Standard of care is an evolving picture. There is incredible amounts of competition for patients because there are so many pharma trials going on. So that's a really difficult space to try and pitch a project. Not because we don't think there are needs there. There clearly are needs there. Not because we don't think there are good ideas. There are lots of good ideas there. It's just that the prospects of successfully recruiting the patients and delivering the results are actually quite challenging. Whereas in some other, in a different indication like angiosarcoma, for example, not much interest, not much competition for patients, and very little active trial activity. So these are factors that we look at independent of the drug and independent of the mechanism of action and so on. We want to know, is this a project that's actually going to be able to complete and deliver change?
Okay, sounds good. Let's see here. You know what? I might just go right now with and we just have like a minute or two left here. Maybe do you guys have any concluding thoughts? Maybe I'll give the opportunity. Barbara, do you have just a thought here?
I'll just close by saying that, when researchers and clinicians and people like who are attending this, they look at repurposing and they're going after funds and research dollars and publications. Repurposing may not be the first thing you think of, but when it comes to patient impact, it is an incredibly fun, innovative space to come up with the combinations and the types of projects, to be a part of a project that, as Pan said, you're looking at a drug that's been on the market for 30 years and to come up with new ways to use it that impacts patients. It's really what we're all here for. It's what the entire sector is here for. So we have an open call for proposals right now in rare pediatrics. We're going to be having several others in lots of different spaces later this year. There's organizations like the Anti-Cancer Fund and like ours, and many, many others. And I would just say include it in your mindset among the ways to look at your research when you're moving forward.
Sounds good. How about you, Pan? Closing thought?
I can't beat that. I think Barbara summed it up really well. I mean, this is an exciting space to be in, and there is huge potential to make big differences to how we deliver treatments to patients that really need it.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Thank you to the speakers very much, Barbara and Pan. That was awesome. And we had some good discussion there with some questions. So thank you again to all those that attended this session. And yeah, and also stay tuned for a future session that we have, which is actually our culmination here. So we got an expert panel coming up April 29th. Stay tuned for either emails or social media about this event. And thanks again. Bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you for having me.